I'm Inez Stepman,
I'm Will Chamberlain.
I'm Amber Duke.
I'm Ben Weingarten.
and this is NatCon Squad, where common good and common sense meet. NatCon Squad is produced by the Edmund Burke Foundation, the home for national conservatism. Subscribe now on Apple Podcasts, Stitcher, Spotify, YouTube, or wherever you get your podcasts. Okay, we have a intense lineup for you today. It's funny, we're even pushing the passage of the big beautiful bill to final thoughts because we have so much other news to deal with. We're going to kick it off with the only topic on the internet, the Epstein conspiracy. Will's going to take us through that, and then we're going to talk about the tragic floods in Texas and a narrative that liberal media is spinning about those tragedies. And then I'm going to talk about a 8-1 SCOTUS case that came down, not on the merits, but has some very important implications for the executive branch versus the bureaucrats. And finally, Ben is going to take us through how RussiaGate, a recent assessment shows that RussiaGate actually originated with Obama, which is something that I think is not getting the kind of coverage that it deserves. So Ben is going to take us through that. So with that, we'll turn it over to Will to talk about what else but Jeffrey Epstein.
Yeah, so late on Sunday, the DOJ and the FBI put out a letter about what essentially an update on what they were going to do, their review of the Epstein case. They said, quote, the systematic review revealed no incriminating client list, and that there was also no credible evidence found that Epstein blackmailed prominent individuals as part of his evidence, and that they did not uncover evidence that could predicate an investigation against uncharged third parties. So this has led to a firestorm, and a lot of people are extraordinarily upset with DOJ and FBI, arguing for. There's a number of arguments people are making about either lying or cover up going on. There's an old clip from Pam Bondi from earlier this year where she talked about how the Epstein list was on her desk. I mean, she says now that she meant the Epstein. She was talking about the files that were on her desk for review. Actually, I believe, but that's created some arguments out there that she's out and out lying. There's also plenty of old clips when you actually go back to when during the Biden administration, when both Kash Patel and Dan Bongino were either hosting a podcast or going on other people's podcasts, making a lot of claims about what would be in the Epstein files, how they were upset with FBI and how they were performing, et cetera. Now that they're in the FBI and the director and the deputy director, they're suddenly not in a position where they're saying this stuff anymore, and instead they're walking things back. This isn't the first time they've walked things back either. They had an interview on Fox News where they both insisted that Epstein killed himself, and that's probably contrary to what they argued was the case years back before they were actually in the FBI and looking at the evidence. A lot of people are upset. My take on this has been angering a lot of those people because I come from the perspective of I think that everybody involved here, Pam, Kash, and Dan, are all acting in good faith, and they're all essentially doing an admission against interest. Nobody really, especially Kash and Dan, had both made some arguments and done some analysis when they were out of the administration that said, oh, we can do much more in terms of prosecuting the Epstein people. We can put out the list, et cetera. And now that they're actually in office, they have to eat crow because, one, the actually evidence wasn't just laying around, it turns out. Whether that's because the criminality was actually more cabin than we thought, because it limited to Epstein and Ghislaine Maxwell, or whether that's because even if the criminality was more widespread, the evidence of that criminality was destroyed in the, previous 20 years, that just means there was no evidence lying around and there's no evidentiary basis for further prosecutions. It would have been a lot better in my view, for Kash and Dan, and I think they would have been a lot happier if they could come out and say, aha, we found it. We can prosecute the people just like we said we could. But they can't, and they're forced to eat crow. Pam doesn't look good. In particular, I think the big thing Pam Bondi has to apologize for is that stunt with the binders back a few months ago, where she basically, kind of ambushed the influencers with these binders, really made some essentially imply there was going to be more coming on the Epstein front, and then there's nothing to deliver. I think that was a big mistake on her part. And so I don't think she and her team handled the communications particularly well here. But at the same time, I think people are overreacting to this. I think people really need to think what they're doing, especially if they're Trump supporters, if they're accusing Cash and Dan and Pam are being in on a cover-up. That means that Trump too is in on the cover-up of the abuse of children around the world. I don't see that as being possible. I think there's two likely outcomes, the ones I described. Either the criminality was more limited than we thought, or the evidence of the criminality has been destroyed. In either case, I think, I trust Dan and Cash to be telling the truth here. I think that their admissions go against their interests, and I think that people need to give them a little bit less of a hard time. Anyway, that's my take. I'm curious what you guys think.
Yeah, I tend to agree that likely what happened is that Pam Bondi and the DOJ in particular overpromised a bit on what exactly they had access to. And over at the caller, we've been talking to some FBI folks, and they are equally as frustrated with Bondi and the DOJ, like a lot of people on social media, because they feel like they were put between a rock and a hard place because they knew that there was no smoking gun back in April, and then had to watch this Binder situation play out, had to watch this Bondi interview on Fox News while realizing that what she was telling the public was never going to come to fruition. So I think if anyone ends up being sort of the scapegoat for this, it will be AG Bondi. But I similarly feel the way you do, Will, which is that the idea that Kash Patel and Dan Bongino were like co-opted by the deep state seems very unlikely to me. And I also think, maybe some of us were a bit naive or simplistic in the way we looked at this case. Like, did Jeffrey Epstein really just write down like a numerical list of everyone that he was human trafficking to? Like, that's not usually how criminals, especially more sophisticated ones, operate. So it's not super surprising that that doesn't exist, or that he was just better at covering his tracks or the tracks of the people who were working with him. It's obviously not a satisfying conclusion. Obviously, we would want the people that he was trafficking to be held accountable. But I think it's just a good reminder that life doesn't always get tied up in like a neat, pretty little bow.
Similarly, I'm sure my take is not going to be someone that makes people happy. The greatest conspiracy theory that I subscribe to and always have is that Jeffrey Epstein killed himself. So I never found this particularly interesting or credible. I honestly, to the extent that there was a conspiracy around that, I could believe that his wealth and connections bought him a window in which to do it, right? That unlike perhaps another prisoner, he was able to bribe enough, through intermediaries or whatever. This is all speculation, but even this was speculation. But that I could believe. Like, that's a sort of believable level of conspiracy to me, that somebody who's very wealthy and is about to really face, decades in prison after living the high life for years, and hobnobbing with the most wealthy and powerful people in the world, that he didn't want to face those decades in prison and found a way to bribe people to allow him essentially to take the suicide route out. That I could believe. Anyway, but I never really bought into the larger conspiracy aspect of this, which, as an aside, it's very annoying to be told, oh, like your takes are canned or whatever. I haven't changed my take on this since the day he killed himself publicly. So, and as Will intimated, although I do think this was handled badly by Pam Bondi, I mean, there were a lot of people, sort of right-wing influencers who did not cover themselves in glory by repeating obviously manufactured talking points from the White House, so similar to each other that it was literally word for word. So I don't know. This kind of frustrates me. It even frustrates me that it was leading this podcast, honestly, because I think there are so many more important things going on in the world. There's a true crime aspect to this. And again, nobody wants to hear this, but there's a true crime aspect of this that is frankly a little bit like moral rubbernecking. Like, people love this kind of story. It makes them feel morally righteous to talk and think about it. And I don't know. It all kind of feels a little bit licentious to me, and not the more like important implications of it seem very implausible to me. So that's my unpopular two cents on that. In terms of just politics, yeah, this is not handled great by Pam Bondi. I don't think it was handled well by the pendosphere or whatever on the right either. And there are probably some deeper questions involved on like sort of where we sit as a society that has absolutely rock bottom institutional trust, and how that, feeds into what we do believe, what we find plausible, what we don't find plausible. But yeah, I mean, we're going to get to the deep state conspiracy that matters to me at the end of this podcast with Ben's topic. So I think there's plenty to be angry about without getting too far down the rabbit hole.
So I think there are a couple of different threads to this story that are worth kind of compartmentalizing, so to speak. And one is, what did administration officials say and or promise or suggest was coming versus what actually has resulted? And is there an inconsistency in the messaging? Was the messaging just ham-handed? Or does the distinction in the messaging, particularly from the Attorney General, suggest that something happened and that there is substance underlying the apparent inconsistency that itself raises questions? We have no trust around anything, any truth coming out regarding this case, because Epstein had ties to every powerful and influential figure in Western civilization under the sun, and he seemingly had compromise on all of them, and he was a billionaire, and we can't explain it. And so then when you get there's no there, sort of regarding the factual record of his criminality and the gross and massive nature of it. And then there's no there regarding the fact that the guy dies and allegedly kills himself in prison, when you have all these people who obviously have a motive for him to go away and to be silenced. You're just never going to satisfy everyone. And so the thing is that the sort of official line here is going to fuel conspiracy theories in perpetuity, even among people who have confidence in the Attorney General, trust the FBI director and his deputy as well. And I should say, I've had interactions with Dan Bongino in the past, and I think he's totally upstanding, and I trust him implicitly. But you're never going to, I think, satisfy most Americans with there's no there here regarding these theories, because there's just so much out there in the way of, we know that certain things did happen. We know that there is a massive record there. And how do we square that with what the official line is? So I just think that we're going to have conspiracy theories and people going down rabbit holes in perpetuity. I wish there was a way that there could be maximal transparency from the administration here to put a pin in conspiracy theories to the extent that they shouldn't exist. But all that said, stepping back, I agree in the main with Inez. In some ways, this is a diversion. It's not public policy going forward or justice going forward necessarily. And that was sort of the point that President Trump made when question from a reporter came up during a press conference around this. He sort of said, why are we talking about Epstein today? On the other hand, there's the broader theme of, you have very powerful people and their misdeeds are constantly covered up. They are never exposed. They are never brought to justice. And so this fuels the idea that there is, which I do think there is, a two-tier justice system, but it only further fuels that narrative, because you have all these people, again, whose alleged malfeasance, if not crimes, gross crimes, appear to have died with Epstein's death. So on the one hand, it's not the most pressing story for the public interest, but on the other hand, it is one massive anecdotal example of myriad examples that we've seen in recent decades that are only going to further fuel mistrust and distrust of our institutions, oftentimes justifiably so. So that's where I kind of come out on the whole thing.
Yeah, and just putting a pin in one particular thing that's circulating, the allegedly the 1 minute missing from the tape that they released, right? Apparently that happens in every day. There's the way that the tape turns over, and they're going to release additional videos from the, like, not related to Jeffrey Epstein, from the prison, that shows that just have the tape deck. Like, they have a very old system, and it recycles itself once a day. So that's just one particular thing that, yes, could be more transparent, and apparently they're going to be more transparent. They're going to release a bunch of other video from the prison that shows that it happens every day. In any case, We're going to move on, and we're going to talk now about, unfortunately, the tragedies in Texas and the flash flooding there. Amber.
Yeah, really, obviously tragic and disturbing story. As of time of recording this podcast, there have been more than 100 confirmed deaths, with almost 200 people missing, and a lot of those deaths were of young people, specifically summer campers who were at all girls an all girls camp in Texas, really young, like 5 to teenagers. And the left decided that the proper response to this flash flooding, this tragedy, was to immediately politicize by trying to blame President Donald Trump, Elon Musk, and Doge. There were cuts made to the National Weather Service by Doge that, according to the left, rendered the agency unable to properly warn people about the flood that was coming so that they could evacuate in time. And there were even some people, including teachers and other semi-prominent people, actually almost ghoulishly cheering on the fact that these kids died, because they believe that since they were in Texas, their parents must have been Trump voters, and so they essentially got what they deserved. Really just base level disgusting nonsense. But getting into a little bit of the accusations about the Doge cuts, it quickly turned out that none of this was true. A few meteorologists came out, noted that the National Weather Service actually had extra staff on duty prior to the flash flooding. They were not understaffed, as a lot of the accusations claimed. They sent out emergency alerts 7 hours before the flood, 2 hours before the flood, and then there was an evacuation alert in the dead of morning at around 4 a.m. when the water started rising very rapidly, which of course is when a lot of people were sleeping. You also have young kids involved, so that complicates evacuation efforts. A camp counselor who's a teenager trying to get a bunch of 5, 6, 7-year-old girls out of a cabin as water's coming in is obviously a very difficult situation. There's not really anyone to blame about that. It's just the circumstances were very drastically unfortunate. There was actually a reporter at the White House press briefing this week who asked Caroline Leavitt, why was the emergency alert sent while people were sleeping? And Caroline appropriately responded with just confusion as to how someone could ask a question so dumb, because the alert obviously was sent while people were sleeping, because that's when the flash flooding was happening. Again, timing. I think, getting beyond the politics of the situation, one of the things that's been sort of heartening to see is that there's been a lot of stories of really true American heroism out of this event. There was a Coast Guard swimmer who had only completed his training about 6 months ago and was on his first rescue mission, who is credited with saving 165 lives, of guiding these young people to safety. There were boy camp counselors at a nearby all-boys camp who were said to have risked drowning in order to push the boys up onto the high bunks or into the rafters to get away from the floods, even themselves going underwater at some points. And then a female camp counselor who was credited with bringing all of her bunkers to safety, as well as the owner of the all-girls camp, tragically losing his own life while rescuing people from the rushing water. So those are the stories that would be worth focusing on in the aftermath, as opposed to pointing fingers at the president because of a lie about the National Weather Service that ultimately had nothing to do with what ultimately happened. But I'm curious about y'all's thoughts about the response to this, and I guess what it really says about society, that many people's gut instinct is, one, to lay blame without proper evidence or facts, and then two, to even revel in the deaths of children for the purpose of scoring political points.
Yeah, I mean, I'm hoping that the latter is not so much a symptom of society as it is like a few sort of actors being elevated by social media, because that's kind of the dynamic that I saw. One of them turned out to be fake entirely. One of the ones that was going around was like a fake construction of some poor woman named, I think her name was Faith Hicks or something. But anyway, it was a fake account created with pictures of her taken from the internet that said that was one of the most viral incidents of like somebody basically saying, well, these like white fascist children deserved it and their parents, voted for Trump or whatever. So hopefully some of that is just social media amplifying what are either like trolls or fake, outright fake stuff, or alternatively just, crazy vicious people that wouldn't get much credence. The part of that is more systemic, I think, is the way that the media has covered this, and you can almost spin a wheel. If there's a Democrat in charge when a natural disaster happens, right, then it's climate change. And that's the narrative that is run with by all the papers. And then if there's a Republican in charge, for example, in the White House, then it's directly malfeasance or incompetence from the Republican in charge. It's you can almost just throw the dice and see what's going to come up every time. It's like playing with loaded dice. Obviously, this is an incredible tragedy. Maybe some of the impulse to try to do this, I mean, if I'm going to be extremely charitable to the people involved, is some nexus of control, when instead of just accepting that sometimes there's a huge flash flood in the middle of the night, in a way that is not really that is very difficult to deal with for emergency services, and in a way that makes sure that everybody comes out alive, and tragedies happen, unfortunately. I'm really glad you mentioned the rescue swimmer Scott Ruskin. Amber, I think this was, again, every one of these tragedies, I mean, I'm biased, but especially in America, I think uncovers some heroes that act, don't wait for the government. They don't, sort of wait for the official services to get there. They go ahead and sometimes risk their lives for others, to bring others to safety. There's just an enormous amount of inspiration in that. But yeah, I mean, the media coverage has been predictably disgusting. Just to highlight one particular piece of that coverage, Ted Cruz just has bad luck, apparently, when it comes to vacations. There was that whole blow up when the power grid got knocked out in Texas, in an ice storm, and he was in Cancun, right? And he had to fly back. It's happened again. He and his family were in Greece on a vacation, planned vacation. He immediately flew back to Texas as soon as he heard about this, and apparently has been helping to coordinate efforts, their rescue efforts. But there was just this disgusting Daily Beast piece published, basically blaming Ted Cruz for not being there, for being on vacation, not predicting that there was a flash flood in his home state. And his comms director got really mad on Twitter and used some profane words to describe the Daily Beast and how completely unfair that piece was. So suggesting that like he basically went on vacation while this was happening, instead of the reality, which was that he was on a planned vacation, and then in the middle of the night this happened, and he got back to the state as quickly as he conceivably could next flight out. So just one example. And yeah, I mean, we should expect this. It worked for them. I think the first instance I can really remember this is of this happening. It worked for the liberal media then, was pinning Katrina on George W. Bush, even though local response was more responsible for there really was like huge incompetence in the response, which there's no evidence of here. But it was not, mostly not done by the federal government. A lot of the incompetence was on the state and local level, but since those were Democrats, the media fixated on the Republican president. So it worked for them more than once. We should expect them to do it again, even as we obviously should point it out as morally disgusting, which it is.
Yeah, I mean, I don't have too much to add here. I mean, it's just tragic, and all those kids, man. And there's not a lot you can say about it. Every attempt to smear the National Weather Service. I mean, for one, those changes haven't, I think, probably, as Amber mentioned, those changes haven't even been put in place in terms of any staffing cuts. And two, I read somebody explaining that there's no way to effectively predict. Once you get to a certain level of very heavy rain, you're not going to predict the exact amount of heavy rain and whether or not, in fact, there will be the degree of the flash flooding. The idea of blaming the Trump administration for this is so silly, but it's just a classic Democrat move to blame Republicans for the weather, and really shameful in this instance.
It's an unthinkably horrific tragedy that is compounded by the ghoulishness. The ghoulishness on social media, I suspect, probably is louder than it is actually widespread in the body politic. But on the other hand, the way that legacy regime media responds is very representative of where the quote unquote journalist class is. There's just no low to which they won't steep to try and score political points. And the sad thing is, one among the sad things here is that it's just become totally normalized to try to hyper politicize a tragedy immediately without any evidence or credence. And I don't see a way that the genie goes back in the bottle. The left has made it such that politics pervades every single aspect of American life, and everything has to be framed through that prism. And you have to respond immediately with a political response to any world event of any consequence. So I just don't see a way that the genie is going to be put back in the bottle. I don't see that there's going to be some societal move in the other direction. I don't know what would cause a sea change there. And so consequently, the discourse is just going to continue to degrade and degrade until and unless people say enough is enough, there they go again, and we need to stop this. But there doesn't seem to be any appetite for that at this point. So I think it's a sorry state of affairs for the country.
And with that, we're going to turn to my subject, which is an important 8-1 decision from the Supreme Court. Even though the merits of this are, I shouldn't even say merits, it's essentially a procedural decision. But the merits of what was actually before the court are relatively simple, which is why it was an 8-1 decision. And we can get to Justice Ketanji Brown Jackson's dissent once again, where even her colleague Sotomayor is fed up with her. She already sort of embarrassed Kagan, I think, but even Sotomayor is now embarrassed about her inability to actually deal with the legal issues in front of the court. But in any case, the substance of this decision affirms the president's right to both fire and restructure to some degree, and that degree, the merits of that degree are still, will end up before courts or going back down to lower courts, and we'll probably end up in some way or another back in front of the Supreme Court. But this is a pushback once again against totally out of control district judges. In this case, in San Francisco, it's a district judge in San Francisco who implemented the totally crazy remedy of actually telling people that the executive branch had let go, that they should defy those orders and essentially continue coming in to work for an administration that had said that they need to leave. The case is Trump against the American Federation of Government Employees, and the 8-1 majority rightly said that, that during this litigation, the district court cannot just tell the Trump administration who and how they should run the executive branch. The substance that will eventually become important, and I think there's a whole bunch of cases working their way up through the courts on more or less the same subject, is how much control the president has over his own executive branch. And that's an enormously important topic. I think actually I have a piece coming out in the American Mind on this subject, but I think this actually is probably going to be, after immigration, the biggest legacy and most important and long-lasting legacy of this second Trump administration, will be to bring before the court and hopefully resolve issues of restoring the president's power over the unelected bureaucrats that staff the executive branch, and pushing back both against those unelected bureaucrats and against Congress, who has, created all of these convoluted rules for how exactly and under what circumstances people working for the president can be fired by the president. So like I said, it's a topic of enormous importance. This is an important tipping of the hand of the court, that even most of the liberal members of the court believe that lower court judges should not be reversing the president's decisions about who he wants to have working for him or not working for him before we even get to the merits of the reorganization of government and the mass firings in this case. This is all around an EO that the Trump administration put out that essentially tells agencies to create a plan to do these things. And it says within the law, in all lawful ways. And so that's the substance of this order. It's a good sign that they were able to get even the liberal justices. I would imagine at least those two liberal justices will be pulling off when they get to the merits. And in fact, Sotomayor, of course, tipping her hand that she will be with Justice Jackson when it comes to the merits. But again, laughing at Justice Jackson for writing an entire opinion on the merits of something that actually technically did not come before the court at all in this case. So throwing it out to the group about this case, some of the other ones, so there's a Trump against Wilson. There's like a whole series of essentially these firing cases, each one with a different agency structure. And then just to talk about any of those cases and the potential there about this, once again, like a district judge problem with these emergency stays. And then also just the dynamics of the court and the fact that Justice Jackson does not seem to understand what she so contemptuously called the legalese in a previous opinion. So any of those topics, fair game.
Yeah, well, I mean, the funny thing is that when we were talking about judicial stuff, I thought we were going to talk about that temporary restraining order from that judge in Boston who randomly decided that, I mean, the big beautiful bill obviously just passed and defunded Planned Parenthood. And a judge in Boston decided in her wisdom to issue a temporary restraining order against the defunding of Planned Parenthood that was just enacted by legislation on some bizarre bill of attainder theory. Like the idea being that once a funding, money is allocated to an organization, that money cannot be withdrawn because doing so unfairly targets the organization that previously gotten funding. Totally absurd. A continuation of the war. And it, just shows that, there's still obviously going to be continued craziness even after the Supreme Court's decision in the CASA case.
Yeah, just to add to that point, what these actions show, there was also Judge Murphy, who I think we talked about in Massachusetts, who just ignored a Supreme Court order, and the Supreme Court sort of, I guess, diplomatically recently smacked him down. Good to see, obviously. Good to see the Supreme Court here say that you can't enjoin the administration from even preparing plans. But by the way, there are a number of injunctions, to Inez's point, extant, which do just that. It's not only that you're not allowed to implement the policy that you, the executive, are trying to implement for the executive branch. You can't even formulate plans about the policy, the documents. That includes, by the way, I think in the birthright citizenship cases, at least one of the injunctions, because there were several cases that were consolidated as CASA, prohibited the administration from even developing the plans necessary and the guidance necessary to ultimately implement the order, irrespective of whether or not they could actually implement the order under the law. But what this illustrates is that the Supreme Court has insufficiently reined in resistance radicals in robes in the lower courts. Just because the court has curtailed universal injunctions, we already know, of course, that plaintiffs are working on now universal class action lawsuits, or basically using states as third parties to stand in for individual plaintiffs to effectively try and secure universal relief. So there are going to be all these workarounds that plaintiffs pursue. And then you have resistance judges who are just out of control with their power, usurping power, in the case that Will mentioned, from not just the executive, but the legislative branch, obviously, because we're talking about statute here, obviously usurping power from the president. And so what is going to make the inferior court judges change their behavior, to me, is the real question that the Supreme Court has to answer. And then also the legislative branch is probably going to have to answer. Maybe the executive branch ultimately, which the left wants, because the left wants to try to impeach Donald Trump for defying a court. And the administration, of course, has stringently not done that to date. But the question is, what is going to cause lower court judges to stop with the radicalism? It's not enough to get overturned on appeal, clearly. It's not enough to get smacked down by the Supreme Court on an individual basis. So there has to be either a change in policy regarding the lower courts, there have to be impeachment efforts, or something more substantial to ultimately serve as blunt deterrent force here, I think, against the resistance judges. Now, that said, on this particular matter from the Supreme Court, I think it's all to the good that we got an 8-1 on the fact that, yes, the administration should be able to formulate its plans. I'm less confident on where ultimately the Supreme Court shakes out on both whether an administration has to spend certain funds that have been appropriated, and also reductions in force. If you start looking at this issue, large-scale reductions in force, the administration has cited plenty of massive restructurings in the past, so maybe that will ultimately prevail when this argument on the merits gets to SCOTUS. But how big can those rifts be, and what are they supposed to look like? The executive order itself says basically rifts consistent with the law, and that is sort of the blanket protection here of their policy. I am concerned that the Supreme Court, that we might not get a durable and robust majority which says the executive has total power over the executive branch consistent with whatever statute says. I'm not sure we're going to get there. We'll have to see. But 8-1 is good. And Justice Jackson, once again, she wants to argue on the merits when that's not before the court. No surprise there.
Yeah, I don't have much to add here except how much I'm enjoying the Ketanji Brown Jackson smackdowns from the rest of the court during this term between Amy Coney Barrett and this time Sonia Sotomayor. It's really incredible to see the vast chasm of intelligence and intellectual prowess between pretty much every other justice in Ketanji Brown Jackson. I saw a video the other day too of her talking about how she as a Black woman ended up in an unprecedented place, referring to the Supreme Court. And you have to watch it to get the full, I think, effect. But she has this very put on sort of Disney character-esque voice as she's giving this speech, and it's just truly incredible stuff.
Yeah, I might have to revise my long-held opinion that Sotomayor is the dumbest member of the court. I mean, I'm still not totally. I'm the jury's still out. But Kagan is clearly, to put my balancing bona fides on the table, Kagan is clearly an intelligent Supreme Court justice with ideas that I don't like. But Sotomayor and Jackson are both. I don't think they're intellectually of a caliber that should be on the Supreme Court. And I think it comes out every so often. And this dissent from Jackson is another feather in her cap in that direction. In any case, let's move to our final topic before final thoughts. Ben, can you tell us about this Obama assessment?
Right. So in some ways, this is ancient history, but in some ways, what transpired in RussiaGate and the lack of justice and accountability and full transparency into it continues to sort of loom over Washington, D.C. So our listeners and viewers will probably recall that in the run-up to the start of the Trump 1 administration, the outgoing Obama administration rushed to produce this so-called intelligence community assessment regarding Russia's role and Russia's ambitions with respect to its alleged meddling in the 2016 election. And one of the most controversial and provocative and propagandistic parts, in my view, of the ICA, the assessment, was that the intelligence community, and not all of it, by the way, because there's only a few agencies that actually were consulted in pulling this document together, assessed that Vladimir Putin aspired, that's the word they use, to help Donald Trump in the 2016 election. And part of the debate around this document and what that assessment was based on was the dubious Steele dossier actually what predicated that argument? Did it underlie that argument or justify it? And all of these individuals, all the leaders in the intelligence community, the national security apparatus, Comey, Clapper, Brennan, et cetera, they said under oath, under penalty of perjury, essentially, alongside other officials, no, the Steele dossier wasn't part of this at all. Well, the director of the CIA, John Radcliffe, ordered a review of the tradecraft behind that document in May 2025 for a lessons learned on the procedures, the analytic tradecraft, et cetera, behind that document, particularly with an eye towards this view that Putin wanted to help Trump win, which, of course, was a central argument underpinning the idea that Donald Trump was a traitor on behalf of Russia, et cetera, and was a key part of RussiaGate itself, which sabotaged and subverted minimally the first 2 years of the first Trump presidency. So here's what the CIA found in conducting this review. There were, quote, multiple procedural anomalies in the preparation of the ICA, including a highly compressed production timeline, stringent compartmentation, which led to departures from standard practices in the drafting, coordination, and reviewing of the ICA. These departures impeded efforts to apply rigorous tradecraft, particularly to the assessment's most contentious judgment. That judgment, of course, being that Putin aspired to help Trump. Now, the biggest finding, arguably, besides that dry language there, which is, by the way, consistent with what the House Intelligence Committee found in its own report, particularly with regard to this whole Putin aspired to help Trump assertion, was the role of the Steele dossier. So as Ratcliffe's review showed, the Steele dossier was a part of this assessment. The decision by agency heads to include the Steele dossier ran counter to fundamental tradecraft principles and ultimately undermined the credibility of the key judgment there. The ICA authors first learned of the dossier and FBI's leadership insistence on its inclusion on December 20th, that was of 2016, before the assessment came out in January of that year. FBI leadership made it clear their participation in the ICA hinged on the dossier's inclusion, and they repeatedly pushed to weave references to it throughout the main body of the ICA. Brennan himself wanted to include the ICA, quote, for narrative consistency. That's in the words of this CIA review. And ultimately, agency heads decided to include a 2-page summary of the dossier as an annex to the ICA with a disclaimer that the material was not used to, quote, reach the analytic conclusions, but they placed reference to that material in the body of the ICA as the fourth supporting bullet for the judgment that Putin aspired to help Trump win. And as the CIA characterized it, implicitly elevated unsubstantiated claims to the status of credible supporting evidence of the judgment. So there's a lot of jargon in here, but basically they laundered the Steele dossier in to justify this massively provocative and substantial assertion that, of course, was completely dubious, debunked. It was political propaganda, and they could never corroborate any of the key parts of it, certainly couldn't at the outset, and never did ultimately, they being the national security apparatus. So there are a couple of takeaways here. Before we get to the fact that, of course, Brennan and Comey now are reportedly facing criminal referral and under investigation, in no small part, it appears, according to reporting, for perjuring themselves regarding their claims of Steele dossier, nothing to do with the intelligence community assessment. My colleague at Real Clear Investigations, Paul Sperry, has written an article out today, Wednesday, which breaks down, here are all the times they said the Steele dossier had nothing to do with this, which is completely undermined by what was revealed in this CIA report. But I think the biggest takeaway ultimately is that Obama rushed to get this intelligence community judgment out. And as the CIA notes, usually these assessments, they take months to prepare. This was prepared in a matter of days with meddling from senior-most officials. I believe that the reporting shows historically that this was a close hold effort of Brennan confidants, essentially pulling this together. It was a slapdash, ham-handed, rushed effort, which of course is going to lead to errors. As this assessment shows, there were no sort of competing views put into it, essentially. And the bottom line is, it seems that they had a judgment that they wanted, which was Putin wanted to help Trump, and they rushed this report out to try and justify that. Then they lied about what they used to predicate it. But all of it, at the end of the day, is Obama. Obama and Brennan knew, remember, we've seen those reports showing that in the summer of 2016, Hillary Clinton was going to try to cook up something about Trump-Russia. And Obama, of course, remember, had that meeting where he said, we want things done by the book, but we can't share information about Russia with the incoming Trump team. And oh, by the way, it just so happened that the National Security Advisor, Susan Rice, memorializes this in an email on January 20th, 2017. That is on Inauguration Day, minutes before Donald Trump becomes president. So Obama was behind all of it, as far as I'm concerned. It was his national security apparatus, law enforcement apparatus, that spied on the Trump campaign. It was his apparatus of course, that ginned up this intelligence community assessment. They did all of this with no basis whatsoever based on hearsay, barroom talk, so-called, etc. And the whole idea was to sabotage and subvert an incoming president. Obama remains the person who is almost never mentioned in all of this. And to me, let's see what happens with criminal referrals. I have no confidence that any of these people will be prosecuted, even if they committed black letter of the law, clearly perjured themselves, and maybe worse. Because what jury is going to convict them if this is in DC or in Virginia or Maryland, etc. But set that aside, is Barack Obama going to continue to be insulated or not? Because to me, that is one thing. This should be a stand on his legacy forever. And there are obviously plenty of stands on his legacy. But he meddled in and sabotaged and subverted his successor. And that is a massive, massive assault on our republic. He's never paid a price for it. And so to me, that is a huge story that looms over all of this, beyond the weeds, the details that I've gone into here about how they cooked up this report to try and sabotage Trump. So I leave it to the group. What do you make of these referrals? What do you make of the CIA review? And what about Obama, the man who never goes named when it comes to RussiaGate, yet of course, whose minions, whose principals he directed to execute these operations, of course, by the book?
No one has more effectively wielded and shaped the bureaucracy and the power of what we now call the deep state than Barack Obama. And that's true in the Pentagon and military. It's true in the intelligence community, and it's true in the highest levels of the career staff of government. It's why the previous topic is so important in terms of the court recognizing the executive branch's that the president has full authority over the executive branch. And it is, to me, there is no topic of more importance in terms of the structure of our governance and the ability of the American people to choose both the people and the policies that guide them. I mean, essentially, this entire shameful episode in our history, was a bunch of people who have enormous power, either in the intelligence community or elsewhere in government agencies, deciding that they just didn't like the fact that the American people had swapped out Barack Obama for Donald Trump. Like, that is what this all comes down to, and use those powers to basically try to prevent the consequences of that happening. I don't think there is a bigger scandal in American history, honestly. This is certainly up there with the biggest ones. It's another reason why I find sort of the Jeffrey Epstein stuff a little bit frustrating, because to me, this is a much bigger scandal and remains a much bigger scandal. Thank you, Ben, for laying out the details. For us, every single time there's an advancement that uncovers once again the fact that America's intelligence agencies and career bureaucrats in high places essentially plotted to thwart the election choices of the American people. And yeah, I mean, I don't know how to say it other than that. This is a huge scandal. Oh, one more kind of minor point. This is why the tradition, although unwritten, was that previous presidents would leave Washington, D.C., a tradition that Obama notably flouted by staying in Kalorama, and no doubt having, as we reported and talked about extensively on this podcast when that great tablet article came out about, essentially holding court in a secondary presidency in Kalorama, where all the people that he had burrowed into high levels of bureaucracy and who agreed with basically his vision of the world continued to try to attempt to govern when the American people had thrown them out. So, yeah, I mean, thanks, Ben, for always catching us up on the details of this. But as you say, the high level implications of this directly implicate Obama, and frankly, again, in the biggest scandal, as far as I'm concerned, in American governance and in history. So much for the tan suit theory that was the biggest problem with Obama's presidency.
Yeah, and the Kalorama thing was especially malicious because they claimed that they were going to stay so that the daughters could finish high school. And then, of course, both of the daughters have now graduated college at this point and are working professionally. And yet the Obamas are still here. Interesting how that works. I mean, I think for me, I don't need to go into any more details because Ben laid them out very nicely. But just reading through the media coverage of this report, it's still the same game of, well, John Ratcliffe is manipulating the facts and he's trying to impress his boss, the president, Donald Trump. and he's missing the forest through the trees. And don't forget, the intelligence community said that they did everything right during RussiaGate. So naturally, they couldn't have done anything wrong. They investigated themselves and found out that they did everything perfectly. So it's just incredible how much they dig their heads into the sand and willfully ignore all of the misconduct surrounding Operation Crossfire Hurricane and all of the circular reporting with the Steele dossier in the media. There's never been any real accountability on behalf of the intelligence community or the media for their role in this. And that is one of the most frustrating parts, is just how much they refuse to acknowledge that they were wrong.
Yeah, I think there's the comparison to the Epstein stuff is really, really important. You know, people are saying, oh, they're doing this stuff to escape from the bad news about Epstein. It's like, wait a second. We actually have information. We know that very specific people were involved in attempting to coup the president of the United States out of office with a bunch of nonsense lies from Russia. That's a massive scandal, and it's bigger than the Epstein scandal. And the degree to which people are confident about things which there's just no evidence, there's no actual evidence of in the Epstein thing. Like, oh, he was a Mossad agent. There's no evidence of that. Like, you think that, you speculate it possibly could be true, but there's not evidence that ties it down. Meanwhile, we know what Jim Comey did in RussiaGate. We actually do. We have, like, he's admitted as much to various things involved, and there's been tons of reporting on it. So I think in general, focus on the ball. People are so upset about the Epstein stuff when it's clear that our government is actually taking action against things where there is concrete evidence and maybe they could obtain a conviction.
With that, we're going to move to final thoughts, and I'll go first to avoid the usual standoff. And I just have like a rapid fire list of things. Like, again, each week is so action packed at this point. We're always actively trying to cover as much as we can, but can't get to it. So that's why these final thoughts are so great. One, on the previous topic, there was a great little interview or quote from the outlet Notice News of the U.S., which I hadn't heard of, but just really clear talk from some former State Department and U.S. aid agency officials who had been fired by Donald Trump. Quote, they were so quick to disband aid. The group supposedly instigates color revolutions, but they've done a very foolish thing. You just released a bunch of well-trained individuals into your population. This is coming from former State Department and AID employees. So just underscoring the very real danger of the deep state and intelligence community and State Department. And just there's a lot of, I don't think there is an issue more important than reining in deep state, administrative state, and elected bureaucrats, however you want to describe them. We have essentially a government that operates that does not believe, I mean, frankly, they believe they have more right to rule than people did in monarchy Europe, where they believe they were appointed by God. These people have the same level of hubris somehow. They really, really feel entitled to rule. And when people change their preferred policies, they feel entitled to continue piloting the ship of state in the direction that they see fit versus the direction that the voters have chosen. And there isn't really any other issue more important to me than that. Just a couple other minor things. Doug Mackey, I'm sure somebody will mention, Doug Mackey won his case and a win for free speech and the right to meme in the Second Circuit. Frankly, I think it's probably they didn't want it to go to the Supreme Court to lay down precedent, which is why a left-wing circuit like the Second Circuit vindicated Mackey on non-First Amendment grounds, interestingly. And then Harvard is being referred to their accreditor for civil rights violations, another juicy victory from the Trump administration. So that's my little rundown of things we didn't have time to mention.
Yeah, great stuff. My two final thoughts. One is on Dr. Kevin O'Connor appeared before the House Oversight Committee for a closed-door testimony about the cover-up of Biden's mental decline on Wednesday. And he had previously pushed the date that he was going to come in multiple times, ultimately leading to a subpoena from the oversight chairman, James Comer. But apparently, only an hour into his testimony, after O'Connor was asked if he was asked to lie about Biden's health and if Biden was fit to be president, he pleaded the fifth and effectively ended the interview. So I don't know. Maybe they need to offer Dr. O'Connor immunity to tell the truth. But interesting development in the investigation there. And then there's a story out of Minneapolis that um, falls in line with some things we've talked about previously in regards to progressive prosecutors. It's gone kind of unnoticed, but there was a 17-year-old who was involved in the 2022 Mall of America shooting, where a group of teens executed a 19-year-old near a mall escalator. And the 17-year-old was someone who was tasked with blocking one of the escalators so that this person could not escape. He ended up getting charged as a juvenile for second degree riot, and it's not clear what sentence he received, but effectively got a slap on the wrist. Well, fast forward a few years, in 2023, he was allegedly involved in a shooting outside of a nightclub. And then in 2024, was allegedly involved in another shooting in a public park. So after being able to skate on preventing a victim from escaping a murder, a gang-related murder, 2-3 years later, he's now been charged with actually holding the gun this time in two murders that are also gang-related. And in both of these instances, the district attorney, heavily funded by groups that receive money from none other than George Soros.
So just to comment on the Mackey case briefly, worth noting that the memes in question go back to the 2016 election where Doug Mackey tweeted out several satirical images saying, vote for Hillary by texting XYZ number. And so the charges against him were conspiracy to violate rights because supposedly, I guess, these memes came from some sort of chat. And so the idea that the charge that the prosecutors concocted was that there was a conspiracy to deprive people of their voting rights that Mackey engaged in through his associations with this group by telling people to text their vote when you can't text to vote. That was essentially the argument here. Now, conspiracy to violate rights, mind you, is also something that Donald Trump was later charged with. It could be hugely flexible in the hands of illiberal regime prosecutors, how you try to apply that. But I do think it is worth noting that while it's great that the Second Circuit did toss the case, tell the lower court to acquit Mackey, it was narrow in that it was on the conspiracy issue, that there wasn't a conspiracy here. They didn't really get to the underlying merits of prosecuting someone for putting out a meme like this. So while it is a blow to the censorship industrial complex, at least indirectly, still I think it's a point well taken that this didn't go up to SCOTUS and there was no commentary ultimately on the free speech matters at play here. Separately, article where effectively you have these administrative staters threatening to engage in regime change sort of action in terms of obstruction, which I think speaks to desperation here, or maybe that they're trying to normalize or desensitize us to it by putting it out there in print. Axios also had this piece, Democrats told to get shot for the anti-Trump resistance, where a number of unnamed Democrat members of the House talk about how their constituents are demanding that they engage in action that leads to violence against the Democrats, against activists, essentially, that there needs to be blood drawn at attacking ICE facilities or other agencies, and that basically Democrats just aren't doing enough to resist, and that Democratic voters are demanding violence and other illegal acts of resistance. I think what this portends is, well, first of all, I think this shows that the Trump administration Republicans are being infinitely more effective than they have been historically. So it's a testament to their success. But it also shows that Democrats, the left, just continue to get more and more unhinged. And of course, one of the really telling things in this article is that Axios says many lawmakers said these voters who are demanding these ever more unhinged acts tend to be white, well-educated, and live in upscale suburban or urban neighborhoods. Very telling about where the left is right now and about how politics has broken the brains of so many in America.
Yeah, my final thought is a little more parochial. NatCon 5 is happening September 2nd to the 4th. I don't know. I might not have announced it on this podcast, but I've actually taken a membership role or an actual role with the Edmund Burke Foundation, which runs this podcast as well as the National Conservatism conferences. And I know that we're, putting out speaker invites right now, but you can register. Registration is open September 2nd to the 4th in Washington, D.C. Go to NatCon there. Also, oh, right. Anna pointing out to me, the one big beautiful bill passed, signed by President Trump. I discussed it briefly in my response to Amber, or rather Inez, and the Supreme Court stuff. But yeah, a huge victory for the president, a huge victory for the Republican Party. ICE is going to have 20 times the funding. We're really going to get to see what happens when there really is an unending supply of money for border enforcement and border security. I think it's going to be really good for the country. I saw some interesting graphs where people were showing that traffic in Los Angeles seems to have improved dramatically. It's a wonder what happens when you take unlicensed drivers off the road. Perhaps we should do it more. So anyway, great day that happened last week on July 4th. I hope everybody had a good Independence Day weekend, and I'll leave my final thoughts there.
Unfortunately, they did drop the endowment tax down from 21 to 8%. A few backstabbing senators in the last minute, but overall a victory on the BBB. So with that, second Olive Wheels calls, sign up. We'll all be there at NatCon, at the NatCon conference in early September in DC. So make sure you register for that and come. It's going to be great. And with that, on behalf of Ben, Will, and Amber, thanks for tuning in. I'm Inez Stepman, and we'll see you at the next action-packed NatCon Squad.